Power doesn't change who we are, it only reveals us. And on that fateful morning, inside the walls of a bustling corporate office, arrogance revealed itself in the cruelest way possible. Jamal Rivers had only been at the company a few weeks. To everyone, he seemed like just another employee. He kept his head down, worked diligently, never seeking the spotlight. What they didn't know, what none of them even imagined, was that Jamal wasn't there to simply climb the corporate ladder. He was there for something far greater, something that would change the fate of the company itself. But to his manager, Mark Donnelly, Jamal was nothing more than a target. The moment Jamal walked into the meeting room that morning, Mark's sneer was already waiting. He slammed a folder on the table, making the room jump. "Jamal," he barked, "these reports are late. Again. Typical. I don't know how you people expect to keep up in a professional setting." The words hit like a knife. "You people." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Some employees lowered their eyes. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Everyone heard it. Everyone knew what Mark meant. Jamal's jaw clenched, but he didn't lose his composure. "Sir, the reports were submitted last night," he replied evenly. "Maybe you didn't check your inbox." There were murmurs around the table. Some had seen the reports themselves. But Mark wasn't about to be corrected, not by someone he considered beneath him. He leaned in close, his voice dripping with disdain. "Watch your tone. Around here, you're at the bottom. Act like it." The insult burned. Jamal felt every eye in the room on him, waiting to see if he would break. But he stayed calm, even offering the faintest of smiles. Because while Mark thought he had put Jamal in his place, he had no idea just how wrong he was. The meeting ended with tension thick in the air. Jamal left quietly, his footsteps echoing down the hall, while whispers followed behind him. Some pitied him, some shook their heads. But Jamal knew the truth. In just a few hours, the entire company would see who was really at the bottom and who was at the top. That afternoon, the CEO called for an emergency meeting. The conference room filled quickly, alive with buzzing curiosity. Executives, managers, assistants, all wondering what was so important. At the front of the room, the CEO smiled warmly. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm proud to introduce someone very important. The man who recently became one of our largest investors. The reason this company is still thriving today." The door opened, footsteps echoed, and when Jamal walked in, the room gasped. Every whisper stopped, every eye widened. Even Mark's smirk, so smug just hours earlier, crumbled into horror. The CEO continued, "Everyone meet Jamal Rivers, our newest majority shareholder." For the first time, Jamal stood at the podium. His voice was calm, but every word carried weight. "When I joined this company weeks ago, I wanted to see how it operated from the inside. I wanted to see how employees were treated, how leadership carried itself, and whether the values on the walls meant anything in practice. What I saw was potential, but I also saw arrogance. I saw prejudice, and I saw people treated as if they were less." The room hung on his every word. Some nodded, others avoided his gaze, but all of them felt the sting of truth. Jamal's eyes shifted briefly to Mark, whose face was now pale and drenched in sweat. "Respect is the foundation of growth," Jamal continued. "Without it, no business can thrive. I know this because I built everything I have while being underestimated, overlooked, and told I didn't belong. But here I stand, not at the bottom, but at the very top. And things are going to change." Applause erupted. Employees who once stayed silent now clapped, some with relief, some with pride. The balance of power had shifted in an instant. The irony was almost unbearable. Mark had spent weeks humiliating Jamal, believing he was powerless. But the man he insulted, belittled, and dismissed was the very investor who now had the authority to decide his fate. Later that week, justice came swiftly. Mark was called into HR, his long record of mistreatment laid bare for everyone to see. The decision was unanimous: termination. When he left the building with his belongings stuffed in a cardboard box, the same employees who once endured his arrogance now whispered behind his back. Their silence replaced with condemnation. It seemed like justice had been served. The arrogant had fallen. The underdog had risen. But Jamal knew better. Because true battles don't end when one enemy falls. They only reveal the ones hiding in the shadows. For a few days, the office buzzed with a new energy. Employees walked taller, proud to know the company's future was in the hands of someone who valued respect. For Jamal, it felt like a hard-fought victory, one that finally silenced the prejudice he had endured. But victories, he would soon learn, often invite new battles. One evening, as Jamal stayed late reviewing company files, a knock came at his office door. It was Sarah, a timid assistant who rarely spoke. She looked pale, her hands trembling as she clutched a folder. "Mr. Rivers," she whispered, I don't know who else to trust, but you need to see this." Inside the folder were documents, financial statements, internal memos, and hidden reports. Jamal's brow furrowed as he read. Something was wrong. Very wrong. According to the records, millions of dollars were missing. Entire accounts had been drained under the radar, covered up with fake reports. And worst of all, the signatures authorizing the transactions belonged to Mark Donnelly. But he wasn't working alone. At the bottom of one report, Jamal froze. Another signature stared back at him, one he recognized instantly. It wasn't just Mark. It was a senior executive, someone still inside the company, someone who had applauded Jamal's speech, someone who was still smiling in his face. Jamal looked up at Sarah, his pulse quickening. "Why are you showing me this?" Tears welled in her eyes. "Because I think they're planning to blame you for it. They've already started whispering that you only bought into the company to cover your tracks. If this goes public, you could lose everything." Jamal's chest tightened. He thought the fight was over. He thought exposing Mark had brought justice. But now the truth was darker. Mark had been just a pawn in something much bigger. And as Jamal stared at the forged documents with his name scribbled across fraudulent approvals, he realized something chilling. The fall of one arrogant man had only uncovered a deeper conspiracy. Someone powerful was still pulling the strings. Someone inside the company wanted him destroyed. The lights in his office flickered. The building seemed to grow colder. And for the first time since his rise, Jamal wasn't just an underdog rising to power. He was a target. The story was far from over. If you're really enjoying this story so far, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification button so you never miss any of my latest uploads. Now, let's get back into it. Jamal Rivers sat frozen in his office, staring at the forged documents that Sarah had placed in his hands. His name was scrawled across pages authorizing multi-million-dollar transfers he had never approved. At first, he thought it was a mistake, but as he flipped through each paper, his heart sank lower and lower. It was no mistake, it was a trap. Mark Donnelly, the arrogant manager he had exposed and fired, hadn't been working alone. He was just the face of something bigger, something rotten buried deep within the company. And the worst part? If this went public, Jamal wouldn't just lose his investment, he'd lose his reputation, his credibility, his entire legacy. The man who rose from being mocked as an unimportant employee to an investor would be branded a criminal. "Who else knows about this?" Jamal asked, his voice steady but heavy. Sarah shook her head. "Not many, but I overheard whispers. They're planning to leak the documents to the press by the end of the week. Once it's out, everyone will believe you funded this company just to launder money." The words cut deep. Jamal clenched his fists, the sting of betrayal sharper than any insult Mark had ever thrown. He had fought for respect his entire life. He had earned his place. And now they wanted to strip it all away with lies. But Jamal wasn't the same man they had underestimated in that break room weeks ago. He wasn't going to fold. He had risen once before, and he would do it again. Over the next few days, Jamal quietly began gathering evidence. He pored over internal emails, transaction logs, and confidential memos. Late at night, long after the office lights dimmed, he pieced together a puzzle no one wanted him to solve. And then he found it. A hidden account overseas. Transactions signed not only by Mark, but by someone still inside the company. Someone high up. Someone he had shaken hands with at meetings. It was none other than Charles Whitmore, the chief financial officer. A man who had a smile on his face, applauded his vision, and pretended to be loyal. But behind the scenes, Charles had been the puppet master. Jamal's stomach twisted. He knew Charles had influence, power, and connections. If Jamal made one wrong move, Charles could crush him completely. But dramatic irony was at play here. Charles thought Jamal was blind, unaware, easy to silence. He didn't know Jamal already held the truth in his hands. The showdown came sooner than expected. At the next board meeting, Charles walked in with his usual smug grin, carrying a folder under his arm. Jamal watched closely as Charles passed copies of those same forged documents around the table, presenting them as evidence. "Ladies and gentlemen," Charles said smoothly, "as much as it pains me to say this, we have a serious problem. It seems our investor, Mr. Rivers, has been channeling company funds for his own purposes. I suggest we take immediate action to remove him before this tarnishes our reputation." Gasps filled the room. Some board members looked at Jamal with shock, others with pity. Charles stood tall, confident he had just destroyed the man he secretly despised. But Jamal didn't flinch. Slowly, deliberately, he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder of his own. He laid it on the table, his eyes never leaving Charles's. "Before you act on lies," Jamal said, his voice calm yet commanding, "perhaps you should all see the truth." He slid copies of documents across the table, emails, bank transfers, and hidden accounts, all traced back to Charles. Every fraudulent transaction, every offshore wire, every falsified report, it all led to him. The room went silent. The dramatic irony was cutting deep. Charles had walked in to destroy Jamal, but in doing so, he had delivered himself straight into the fire. Jamal leaned forward, his gaze sharp. "You thought I wouldn't notice. You thought I'd sit quietly while you ruined my name. But the difference between us, Charles, is that I earned my place here with honesty. You tried to take yours with theft. And now, the board knows the truth." Board members flipped through the evidence, their faces shifting from doubt to anger. One finally spoke. "Charles, is this true?" Charles's face went pale. He stammered, tried to deny it, but the proof was undeniable. Security was called, and just like Mark before him, Charles was escorted out of the building, his career in ashes. Justice had been served. The board turned to Jamal with newfound respect. "Mr. Rivers," one said softly, "you've not only saved this company from corruption, you've saved its soul." For Jamal, it was more than victory. It was vindication. Every insult, every dismissal, every attempt to erase him had failed. He was no longer the underdog. He was the man who turned the tables not just once, but twice. But just as relief began to wash over him, his phone buzzed. A text message. It was from an unknown number. The message read, "You may have taken Charles down, but you have no idea how deep this goes. Watch your back." Jamal's breath caught in his throat. He looked up from his phone, scanning the room. Smiles surrounded him, but one truth lingered in his mind. Someone else was still out there. Someone more dangerous. And this fight was only beginning. The story was far from over. And that, my friends, is where part 2 ends. The powerful life lesson here is this. The truth always comes out, no matter how deeply it's buried. Lies may win battles, but integrity always wins the war. Now I have a quick question for you. If you were in Jamal's shoes, would you have exposed Charles immediately in the boardroom, or waited to gather even more evidence first? Comment your answer down below, and don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories like this.